Welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It is Tuesday, February 18th, 2025. On Tuesdays, we look at music and the arts. Today, I want to ask you to tap into your inner genius. Are you a creative genius? Especially in terms of music or the arts, for example? Most would claim not to be. Well, what constitutes genius? Usually, we just mean some type of exceptional ability with respect to cognitive or creative endeavors of some kind or another. If you think about normal distributions, which I was talking a little bit about yesterday, and average abilities in the general population, I'd argue that most people have at least one or more areas where they fall at least 2 standard deviations above the average, or perhaps rank in the 99th percentile. At the same time, there might be areas where you fall considerably short, or you're much further below the average. For example, I'm horrific when it comes to drawing, painting, sculpting, and so on. I tried my hand at all of these areas back in intermediate school and middle school in an art class and without much success. I vividly remember in particular my efforts in creating pottery with an original vase that I did finally manage to complete, but was anything but symmetrical. It was as if Picasso were in his Cubism period and applied his genius to my pottery. The main difference, my pottery was was not an experiment in Cubism, but rather a reflection of my own incompetence. And so, interestingly enough, my art teacher did finally award me a B in the class. Why? Because I think mainly I tried really hard. I took the work seriously enough. You've heard the expression A for effort. Well, I think I got sort of a B for blood, sweat, and tears. I just never had a particularly steady hand, or, if you were to look at my handwriting, you'd say, obviously, this is not somebody who should be trying to create anything with a pen or a paintbrush or that sort of thing. So, in fact, my handwriting is so bad, even though I practiced, we were graded on it in elementary school. But it was so bad, I decided long ago to forego the speed of cursive writing due to my illegibility, and instead I'd always print. And in fact, if you were to look at my college notes, it's all in printing. And indeed, I suck even at printing, but at least I can read my own printing, and most people can as well. So forget the pen in that sense, forget the brush strokes. I was decent enough at drafting, which I took in 8th grade, but that's because I could use the tools that I was given and the geometric figures with which to sketch various drawings. But even then, I wouldn't say I excelled. But I was maybe a competent draftsperson at that age, all those years ago, and I'm not sure how good or creative I would have been in that field. What about other fields? What about other types of bodily movement, like dancing? I've always had a pretty good sense of rhythm, but alas, no real fluidity. Stiff, stilted, and mechanical does not a good dancer make, unless you're doing that sort of robotic stuff. But even then, I think my movements wouldn't qualify as particularly aesthetically pleasing, or what have you. So, in short, I'd have been the first person eliminated if I were ever, co-opted to perform in one of those Dancing with the Stars type of shows and so forth. Again, other people are great at it, and you can just see the difference. Some people naturally are gifted or have that natural sort of bodily flow and what have you. Same thing with martial arts. Interestingly enough, I studied the martial arts. I became a black belt eventually in Shotokan karate. But even though I became a black belt, I can't sit here and say I was really good at it in the sense of a practiced, well-oiled martial artist, somebody who could fluidly perform the different movements, the different katas that we had to learn, for example, which were these basically a series of structured moves in particular order. And each of the katas has different meanings and so forth attached to them. But my general point is that, even in learning the different katas at the different stages and the different belts as I progressed, you would never mistake me for being any kind of a karate master or even en route to becoming a karate master. In fact, I was athletic enough so I could, do a fairly decent job of the strikes and the kicks and the defensive moves and so forth, purely from a kind of technical, muscular standpoint. Um, I could imitate what I was observing reasonably well, but I couldn't really achieve that kind of chi or that flow state that people talk about, right? Whatever that might mean. The energy was certainly flowing through my body, but the end result looked more like I was gasping for air and challenged to get that air rather than that sort of relaxed, explosive, and fluid release of energy. So it was all a bit too exaggerated in my case. So, in short, I looked like someone who had started their martial arts in their 30s, which is in fact the truth, rather than someone who had been learning the language of martial arts from an early age. Okay, well, again, there's so many other areas, though. What about something like photography? I could snap a photo, so can you. But true photographers have a much better sense of lighting and the ability to capture the essence of their subjects in that special moment. I've never, I don't think, ever taken a great photo. I might be able to learn how to become a decent photographer, but again, there's certainly no genius there in my case. What about sartorial experience? I really never learned much about sewing or knitting or crocheting and these sorts of things or clothing design when I was growing up, nor do I feel like I have much imagination to offer the world in these areas. But I see others who are amazing at the work that they do, including my 96-year-old mother-in-law. She's still creating all kinds of new clothing for people, and it's kind of her life project, if you will, to continue her knitting and to continue producing. And she's really good at it, as you might imagine, right? In fact, all the women in my wife's family, including my wife, can create all sorts of clothing, and they know tons about fabrics and designs and colors and so forth. And so, my wife loves to go to the fabric stores, and if I go with her, right, I'll be walking around with her, and I'm deeply ignorant of all that she's talking about, and I'm mostly just helpful in my role as her shopping cart. So anyway, that's fine, but I just don't have any special insights or abilities, I don't think, in that area. There's no genius there either. So, but if we think about design in the broadest sense, to include technological innovations of all kinds, then that opens up a lot of other doors. And there's no doubt that many people, many of you, for example, have genuine abilities and expertise to see what could be produced in different contexts, even if you haven't really been formally trained. I have a brother-in-law, for example, from a former marriage, my first marriage, who never really had much proper schooling. I don't think he even graduated high school. It doesn't matter, but he's wicked smart, as they would say in Good Will Hunting. And he's especially adept at building houses, imagining how things might be put together, how they might come together, and seeing that finished product in his mind. Then he was also able to parlay that ability into becoming an expert furniture maker, or sorry, not furniture, reupholster. So that's a particular trade, a particular art form as well. So in general, I guess what I'm suggesting is there are all kinds of creative genius amongst those who are masters in their fields, from the potter and the hat maker to the welder, the jewelry maker, the landscaper, the master craftspeople across countless trades. And so for those who've never defined themselves as a creative genius, once again, I'd have to imagine they have some special abilities in one or more of these areas as well. And so that's why my wife and I'm sure many of you, love to visit these displays, the tables, the shops where people have fashioned unique furniture or applied their genius to whatever their trade, whatever their endeavor. And of course, when we think about creativity, that also includes the use of words. I never really thought myself as a, I never thought of myself as an especially gifted uh, writer. In whether that be conventional writing or creative writing or poetry, I'm reasonably confident in my ability to use words to convey information, especially of a scientific or a factual nature. I certainly write well enough to publish articles and books in my field, especially, but I've never considered myself to be a writing genius of any kind. I've certainly gotten some compliments in regard to the clarity of my writing. So that's something. And while I love poetry, I'm not that much of a poet either, I don't think. I'm far too literal and only rarely have those kind of inspirational moments or those insights where the words just suddenly come together in brilliant or melodic or unexpected ways. Um, but that's an area where I've dabbled a bit more, and so I'm not going to say I can't do poetry at all. I just again don't think I think of myself as having a special gift in that area. So that brings me then back to this area that I've always been especially fascinated by in the creative arts, and that is music. I had the good fortune many years ago of meeting a truly world class pianist by the name of Karen Hutchinson. And she invited my mother and myself to one of her performances at the Kennedy Center, where she played a number of classical pieces, and her specialty was Rachmaninoff. And I was mesmerized by what I saw that afternoon. She had, that is, Ms. Hutchinson had studied in France for a few years. When she was in the prime of her training, she was, she explained to me, literally playing 10 to 12 hours a day. You can appreciate day after day. You can appreciate what's required then to achieve that sort of world class mastery of the piano. And so, as I say, I watched her perform at the Kennedy Center, and she was amazing. And then I was speaking with her backstage or after her performance, and I asked her about her own music, or her own writing, and so forth. I said, do you do your own music? Do you write music? And very earnestly, right? I wanted to know, with somebody with that kind of ability, she must be able to write just about anything. And she was shockingly blunt in her response. And she said, "Oh, no, I can't write anything myself." I thought, wow, that's amazing, right? She could interpret other people's music. She could play their music. That was her gift. That was her genius. She was not, at least by her own admission, particularly adept at writing her own music as such. So, in my case, I decided, well, what about performing music yourself? I never really learned how to play anything especially well. I never really got into music myself. I never thought of myself as having any kind of a special gift. Many of us, and maybe yourselves included, like to sing, sing along with songs. We don't necessarily have a great voice. I can carry a tune for the most part. I'm cool with that, but I know that's very different than listening to people who, have genuinely beautiful voices. Some have such, their voices are their instruments, and they're so remarkable in terms of their different styles in which they might sing. And that, of course, might be your special gift if you fancy yourself a bit of a singer. Um, okay, so then I thought to myself, well, as much as I like music, there was never anything that I could bring to the world that would be particularly noteworthy or exceptional. Like, I liked a lot of other things that other people have done. I've always been pretty good at recognizing other people's creativity and maybe even their genius to a certain degree, but I never really had a sense of any kind of musical gift myself, except for one thing. I could always hear the music in my head. Again, maybe like many of you, it always made sense to me. And I think a lot of us have that sense of music since almost everyone likes music. In fact, I've only known one person in my own personal inner circle or life of family and friends who genuinely says that he didn't like music. He didn't really understand music. He didn't get it. But pretty much everybody else likes or loves different kinds of music. So interestingly, my aunt had an organ. This is my one of my dad's two sisters, and she lived in New Jersey, and we'd go out there once a year, maybe for a visit. And every time we'd go, I'd be excited because even as a little kid, I'd start fingering around on the organ, and I'd start playing some notes and then some chords, and I'd try to put some things together in some kind of a rhythmic way. I wasn't really writing songs, but I was, to my mind, I was playing the organ, or at least trying to play the organ. And lo and behold, sometimes I'd make this music, and people would say stuff like, "Joey," like little Joey, "Joey, what, that's lovely, what you're playing." And that was that, right? I mean, I wasn't the 3-year-old playing Ode to Joy on the violin like Itzhak Perlman, but I could make music. And again, at least within that limited time frame of visiting New Jersey once a year, whatever it was. Um, but following from that, even though they said, "Hey, you're making some nice sounds," nobody, I mean, to my recollection, I don't remember this. Nobody ever said or asked me about taking music lessons, and I was never signed up for music lessons. And I really never pursued music in any way, other than, again, like most of us, listening to it on the radio, but in my case, also making up songs in my head, which I guess a lot of kids do. And I never learned how to read music, and still don't to this day. But then something funny happened. Some friends were forming a Beatles band, and they needed a drummer. And I happened to have a brother who was an amazing drummer, and is an amazing drummer, and he had a drum kit, so I had access to the drums. And I sat down one day and I just started teaching myself the basics. And I mean, I watched my brother play, so I kind of knew, like, physically what he was doing. And I thought, well, let's just keep it simple and do the simple stuff, right? And so I started listening to the Beatles songs and figuring out the drum patterns and so forth, like a lot of people have done. And thus I became Ringo in a Beatles imitation band, a cover band, if you will, at the age of 17. Certainly not a genius of any kind, and especially if you want to be a drummer, I think it's probably a good idea to start, or it's not that difficult to fake playing Ringo, who, by the way, in his own right, was brilliant. In terms of what he did and what he contributed and how he complemented the songs that he played on. But in terms of the level of difficulty, at least with the basic rhythms and the fills that he was doing, they're not particularly difficult. Okay, to be fair. So that sort of got me more interested in actively pursuing music, a little bit at least. And the next year, after graduating from high school, I decided to pick up a guitar and start learning, like so many of us. You pick up a book, find some basic chord patterns or whatever, and you start learning how to play songs. Just the basics. None of that counts as genius, of course. And because I never really studied music, I never trained formally, I could never become well, at least in my mind, maybe I could have if I really worked at it, but in my mind, I could never become a musical virtuoso or genius on an instrument. I always think of people starting much earlier to develop the dexterity and the nimbleness and the muscle strength and memory, etc., to be able to achieve higher levels of performance on different instruments. So anyway, I obviously started much later. I started really as an adult. So, but that wasn't my aspiration. I was never thinking, "Oh boy, someday I'd like to be this amazing drummer, or someday I'd like to be this amazing guitarist." Okay. And of course, there are many world-class musicians who are stunningly proficient in terms of their abilities, whether in the case like of Karen Hutchinson in terms of her technical abilities and or in terms of their own originality. But then something else truly interesting happened, at least in my case. I was coaching swimming, and there was a piano at the pool in a small gathering room they had there. And so I figured out, well, what if I could take what I knew about the guitar, which I'd learned the previous year, and figure out the basics, the note structures and the chord structures on the piano. So I went in there I decided on a Saturday morning early Saturday afternoon, I remember, taking my guitar in and then looking at the notes that I was playing and then finding those individual notes on the piano and then how they were put together in different chordal structures. Since most songs that you play or that I was playing on the acoustic guitar had just three or four chords or some combination of major and minor chords for the most part, maybe some seventh chords and the occasional augmented, but nonetheless, I'd learned most of the basic chords that you could play in the different shapes on the guitar. And so I thought, well, it should be possible then to apply that same kind of logic and shape structures, and the notes are the same. You just have to figure out where they are on the piano, right? So anyway, as I say, I sat down one Saturday and I started playing and figuring out how to make sounds and chords and so forth. And it all came very quickly. It was very much kind of like a metaphorical Rosetta Stone where I was able to translate between the guitar and the piano. And so I spent all the rest of that Saturday afternoon. I went back in. I was excited by my progress. I went back in on Sunday morning and played throughout the day on Sunday as well. And again, just kind of using the basic chordal structures that I figured out. And then I said, this is amazing. I think I'll record myself. So I had an old, the old tape recorder, press play and record. And I recorded myself playing John Lennon's Imagine. That was the first song I ever figured out on the piano. And I played a couple of other songs. And I thought, wow, I got to share this with my mother. She'll be blown away. So that's what I did. I recorded myself, and then I raced over to my mother's condo. She'd bought a condominium. And I said, Mom, guess what? She said, what? I said, I learned how to play the piano. She said, well, you learned how to play it when? I said, this weekend. And she was incredulous. What do you mean this weekend? That's impossible. I said, no. I said, honest, here, have a listen. So I pressed play, and there out came myself playing my first version. It was a simplified version, but it definitely was Imagine. It was unequivocally, it was clear. It was certainly in rhythm. All the chord changes. It sounded like Imagine, right? Uh, and she said her first reaction was, "That's not you." I said, "Yes, it is." So finally, to prove it, we actually had to drive back over. I had a key because I was an assistant manager and I was coaching. So I had a key to get into the pool area and the inside and so forth. And we drove back over and I played right before her eyes. And again, she was blown away. And so at that point, I did start thinking, well, maybe I have something of a gift. And I wrote down, you know, uh, what I could do, what I'd learned, and then I started figuring out just some basic songs, not just to play, but then I started thinking, well, what about these songs in my head? What if I start putting them into music or musical forms and so forth? And I started writing my own songs. Most of it, of course, was garbage. I still have a lot of that garbage. You're never going to hear that garbage. It's never going to be released or recorded. But over the years, a couple of the tunes ended up being pretty good. And then I had a good friend of mine, again from the Beatles band, a guy by the name of Drew Krause, who played John Lennon when we were in the Beatles. Um, and he also had a really great voice. He's quite the talented musician. I've always thought he was. I wish I could collaborate with him to this day. But he and I, long story short, we recorded four songs together, two of each, two of mine, two of his. And these were pretty good songs. But we had a friend, a friend whose dad had a recording studio. And so we just had one shot. We did it all in one day. We brought in the drums, the guitar. I had an electric piano. We played all the parts. We did all the singing. And mostly we just had like one take or one or two takes to get it all down. So it wasn't, fabulous what we did. But again, thankfully, Drew has a great singing voice. And that really helped with the sound of the songs. But it was pretty cool. So we ended up with four songs, two of each. I've still got those, but they've never been formally released in any format either, and I don't think that'll happen. But I kept the interest in the music, and again, continued to write songs occasionally over the years, but never too seriously. I knew what great music sounded like. I knew what amazing musicians sounded like, and I knew that was all beyond my reach. But then late in life, I thought, well, why not me? No, I'm no Stevie Wonder or Joni Mitchell or Elton John or Brandon Marsalis or anything like that. But I had, over the years, finally, I think, written some pretty good words and some melodies, and together they formed some pretty good songs. Songs that I was actually happy with. It took me a long time to get there, but I finally did. And indeed, I finally had about a dozen songs that I was happy enough with that had been recorded over 30 years plus, to be honest with you. And so recorded my debut album at the tender age of 62. The album titled 62 since 62 and then formally released at the end of 2024. So it's now sold over 100 copies, so I feel like I'm well on my way to catching Michael Jackson and his world record of more than 120 million units of Thriller that he sold or has sold. Um, no, seriously, I'm just happy to have been able to set aside the doubts and the insecurities and not worried about my limited, technical abilities as a musician or what have you, to focus on creating and recording songs that I found to be meaningful and in some cases I think quite beautiful. I'm not trying to be conceited or cocky about that. Masterpieces? No, not at all. But the songs are in a style and with a voice that finally, I think, resonates clearly enough. And I'm confident enough about it to say, hey, I've got an album on sale, or I've got an album that's actually in the record stores in London, Ontario, where I live. And who knows, maybe someday I'll eventually sell the first 1,000 copies of that album and have to print a second 1,000. That's enough for me. Any event. And so that's my advice to you. Identify and focus on your gifts, your voice, broadly defined. In other words, how can you best express yourself creatively? And then start working at your craft when you have the time, when you've decided this is what you really love and this is what you want to do, and take that more seriously and start practicing and honing those skills and those abilities. And so, again, creativity, in my view, can take countless forms, including, as I say, in the trades and technical areas that we don't usually think of in terms of the creative arts. But to me, creativity is creativity, and it can be expressed in an infinite number of ways. So you just have to be willing to identify your special gifts. And then, as I say, you have to work at it then to make yourself better, to hone your craft. And then ultimately, you'll be able to share your creative self, your creative side with others. And trust me, the world will be a better place because you shared your gift. So, thanks for spending some time with me again, and until next time, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives and nurture love in your hearts. Bye for now.